marking failing tests as to do using a fancy to-do annotation. Here's how it's done. But before I start showing how you could implement a to-do annotation like this and why it's different from just a regular old disabled or ignore, I would like to show how we utilize such a technique in Kotlin. Here's the Kotlin compiler repository, and as I have mentioned previously in one of the other videos, we recently had to re-implement one of the Kotlin native components called the Objective-C export header generator. And in order to ensure the quality of this re-implementation, we had this class here, the Objective-C export header generator test. Honestly, we have more tests than this, but this one is the major test that ensures that our new implementation behaves exactly as the old one. And you can spot that we have some strange looking annotation called To-Do Analysis API. Looking into the two implementations, we have the previous compiler K1 and one based upon what was called the Analysis API, which is a abstraction layer over the compiler frontend, which makes the new implementation compatible with the new K2 compiler. You see that we have this test here, and in order for us to work, we check in some test data and then are able to run this test against the old and the new implementation. Check out the old video that I posted to see how this is implemented. When we check in such test data, some of the time we will notice that the new implementation does not yet match perfectly what the old implementation did. And we are still able to check in this tests and mark them as to be done for this new Analysis API implementation. If I am running this test, we should see that all the tests will be running with a K1 compiler, but some of those tests will be marked as to be done. See the tests now being executed for K1. Now you see the same tests being executed with the new implementation. And as you can see, some of those are marked as to do and therefore ignored because there's like some kind of disagreement between the implementations, and it says actual data differs from file content, blah, blah, blah. How can you apply a similar technique? I will show you in a sample project, which is reduced down to a simple fancy test, which will also allow you to mark a test as to do, and therefore it will be ignored, and for your CI also be marked as to do. We can start by creating ourselves a test utils package, and in there create the to-do annotation. Now just marking tests with this to-do annotation will not do us anything. So how can we make sure that this test is actually marked as to-do? The first thing I would like to implement is that this test, if it's marked as to-do, will also be marked as to-do in the build output here. So if you run this test on CI, or if your colleagues run them locally, he will immediately be able to see that this test is not expected to pass under certain circumstances. This can be done by us implementing something that is called a test display name generator, which is an implementation or an extension to JUnit, which is the display name generator. Now with this display name generator, we get the opportunity to generate the display name for a class, the display name for a nested class. We basically only care about modifying the name for the method. Therefore, we will delegate every of those other calls, the name, display name for class and the display name for nested class, to the default implementation, which can be obtained by the display name, by calling into the display name generator, and creating the standard implementation. We then delegate those calls to the default. Now we only need to implement the generate display name for method. We can check the test method if an annotation is present, in this case our to-do annotation. And therefore assume that it is a to-do test. If it is a to-do test, we will return the default implementation's value, but append a small dash dash to-do. Otherwise, we can return just the default. We can easily lift the return here and see if this did the job. It seems like not yet. And we also can see that this test display name generator is marked as unused. So how can we tell JUnit to pick up this extension and use our test display name generator? In a previous video, I was showing that JUnit uses a service loader, and therefore you could use meta-inf services in order to register such extensions. However, the display name generator is not an extension, and it needs to be registered differently. So for this, we need to use a different file. We need to use the junit-platform.properties. And in there, we can now register the default display name generator. We can use junit Jupyter.display name generator default and point it to our test utils.test display name generator. Now let's try if this name generator is picked up. Yes, we can see that our complicated business logic test, while still failing, not being marked as ignored, now is marked as to do. We can verify that this works by just not marking it as to do, and test is just the name of the function, but just marking it with this to do annotation will immediately result in it being also marked as a dash dash to do test. We should now write some special code that allows us to actually mark this test as ignored and do not bother when it fails. For this, we also place a new extension called the to-do test execution failure handler, and it implements the test execution exception handler from JUnit. So it is both the test execution exception handler, test execution exception handler. Makes sense to align the name. So it's both consistent exception handler, and we implement the handle test exception method. Both the context as well as the throwable can be expected to be not null. They are just not properly annotated on JUnit side. In this case, we can again do check if it is a to-do test. So we can ask the context.element to check if there is a get or null. Annotation present. Now, if it is a to-do, we make sure to just abort the test, telling JUnit that it's all fine, doesn't have to necessarily pass. So we can do this by using the assume assumptions and then abort with the message by going with something like test was marked as to do. To do. Okay, like this. Otherwise, if it's not marked as to do, we just rethrow the exception and make sure that the test actually fails. So in this case, just throwable. This is still marked as unused, so we need to register it to JUnit as a service. We can look up where to register the service by going to the interface we want to register and creating the meta inf services and now pasting the full qualified name of the service. So it's living under this package. There's class or interface we want to register as extension. And in there, we can register our to-do test execution handler. If we command click into it, we will see it's now being marked as used. And if we rerun the test, we finally see that it is now ignored and actually marked as -- to do. So everybody working with this test will now be aware that this test is yet to be implemented or yet to be fixed. This is already really, really nice. What problems we have with this kind of to-do annotation is that it still acts pretty much as a ignore or disabled. So it will always be ignored. It will always be disabled. One of the nice things that differentiates this from regular disabled or ignored annotation is that you could theoretically have many of those to-do annotations. You saw that in Kotlin, inside the Kotlin repository, we used something called to-do analysis API, and this carried some kind of semantics, as in this is only disabled for this particular implementation, or this might be only disabled on a certain host. Or you could also add some parameters to your annotation, and then based upon what the actual value of the parameter is, you could handle these cases differently. What you could also do, which I heavily recommend, is also making sure that when you check in such a to-do annotation, to handle the case if it actually passes, so you do not have some tests checked in that actually would theoretically pass, but are still marked as to-do. So in order for us to do this, we can implement this after each, and we can theoretically mark if or check if this was marked with a to-do, and if it reaches the after each, it means that it is still marked as a to-do, but it is actually passing. So we should probably tell somebody about their to-do annotation and request that it might be removed. This can be done by retrieving the element of the context of the current test execution, checking if this is a to-do, if this test was marked with a to-do. So check if the to-do annotation is present, and if the context has some kind of exception present. So if both of this happened, not present, then in this case, we know that the test was marked with a to-do, but there was no exception present. Now we need to report this as some kind of failure back, where we can state that test passed, to-do annotation still present. Please remove the add to-do. Let's try this out. This test here is still not passing, but we could look into the test. It returns foo. Now, if we change it to bar in order to make the test pass, but we still have it marked as to do here, we should now see that the test is actually now failing. It's not ignored anymore. It's now failing. It says to us the test passed, to-do annotation still present. Please remove the add to-do. We can go to the test, remove the to-do, and we'll see that, yes, indeed, test is green. Only if we accidentally have the test being passing while still having the to-do annotation present, then it now reports it as an actual failure. So in this case, a CI could prevent you from accidentally having those tests disabled when in actual real life, the tests now would finally pass.